first week. So thank you for joining us. You're joining an activity that's been hosted on behalf of and organized on behalf of the Environmental Climate Justice Team at UUSJ. So if you'd like to get involved with that team, please let me know. And I can get you details or talk to you about that as an opportunity. So I'm just going to do a quick little reading to sort of give us some framing for our space, since, as many of you know, UUSJ is a faith-based organization. My name is Pablo de Jesus. I'm the executive director of Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice. So here goes this is a greeting and thanks that was given to me by Reverend Karen Scrivo. And it's originally from the Onegada Nation. I think that's how it's pronounced. Greetings and thanks to each other as people. To the Earth Mother of all, greetings and thanks. To all the waters, waterfalls, and rain, rivers, and oceans, greetings and thanks. To all the fish life, greetings and thanks. The grains and the greens, the beans and the berries, as one we send thanks to food plants, medicine herbs of the world and their keepers, greetings and thanks. To all animals and their teachings, greetings and thanks. The trees for shelter and shade, fruit and beauty, greetings and thanks. To all birds, large and small, joyful greetings and thanks. And from the four directions, the four winds, thank you for purifying the air we breathe and giving us strength, greetings. The thunderers, our grandfathers in the sky, we hear your voices, greetings and thanks. And now the sun for the light of a new day and all the fires of life, greetings and thanks. For our oldest grandmother, the moon, leader of women all over the world, and the stars for their mystery, beauty, and guidance, greetings and thanks. To our teachers from all times, reminding us of how to live in harmony, greetings and thanks. And for all the gifts of creation, for all the love around us, greetings and thanks. And for that which is forgotten, we remember. We end our words, now our minds are one. Greetings and thanks. So, and with that, I'm just going to get us going. So I'm so excited to have Joe Thwaites, who is an associate in the World Resource Institute's Sustainable Finance Center. His work focuses on enhancing the climate finance ambition of developed countries, supporting climate vulnerable countries in their engagement in international financial policymaking, and ensuring a just transition in the shift from fossil to clean financing. Prior to joining the Institute in 2014, Joe researched innovative approaches to climate diplomacy at Adelphi, a Berlin-based research institute. He previously worked on European Union climate and energy policy for Friends of the Earth, focusing on policies to strengthen energy efficiency and expand renewable energy. Joe also has experience working on UN arms control and nuclear non-proliferation negotiations at the Quaker UN office in New York City. Joe holds a master's degree in global environmental policy from American University in Washington, D.C., where his research focused on climate diplomacy in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN Security Council. And he has a bachelor's degree in politics from the University of York in the United Kingdom. So we basically have one of the most highly recommended experts that you knew about, and I went out and I begged Joe to join us, and he happily agreed. He was actually rather excited for what we're trying to do with this adventure in advocacy on the Green Climate Fund. So we're eager to hear his thoughts and comments and to sort of shape our understanding of the Green Climate Fund. And with that, I pass it to Joe.
Thank you so much, Pablo. And as you were reading out my bio, I realized I have a ridiculous amount of acronyms, which I think comes with this territory. We love using acronyms when it comes to UN stuff, climate stuff, congressional stuff. But I see UUSJ has an acronym, so I feel like I'm in good, in a good group here. And yes, as you mentioned, I think I worked with the UUUN in New York when I was working for the CUNO, which is the Quaker UN office. And so, very appreciative of the work you do. And I would say in general, faith groups have been some of the most passionate and effective advocates for the US doing more on climate finance in general for developing countries, but also on the Green Climate Fund in particular. When I joined WRI in 2014, a colleague of mine was holding down the GCF brief back then, and he was always talking about how important it was, and that's just grown and grown over the years. And I'll cover the rocky history of the Green Climate Fund in the US. I have a few slides that I'll go through, but yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I'm very happy to answer questions, and really excited to hear your ideas and your thoughts on how you want to engage around this. So let me just find my PowerPoint. So yeah, the Green Climate Fund in the United States is a sort of long and rocky history, but I wanted to start. Sorry, is that? Can you hear me? I think I might have just frozen.
You're good now, sir. Thank you.
Great. So I wanted to start by kind of zooming out a little bit, and just looking at the fact that where we are in terms of climate action and the urgency of climate change. And a few weeks ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the UN convened group of the world's top climate scientists, and it's hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists contribute to these reports. Put out their third report in the latest assessment report cycle. And this one is on mitigation, so on reducing emissions to address the challenge of climate change. And in this report, there was this graphic, and it was very controversial. And I'll get into why it was controversial in a bit, because essentially the way that these reports work is that the scientists get together over several years and write the report, and they write, they survey all the different literature, and they come up with the essentially the best available science that they have at the time, and it goes through a rigorous review process. Anyone actually can sign up to be a reviewer, and to submit comments on these reports. And then at the end, they produce the scientific report, and that's set. But then the summary for policymakers is negotiated by governments. And they negotiate line by line, essentially a synthesis of the key findings of the report. And that gets quite politicized. And so this graph was one that was quite controversial, because the US and China were butting heads about the graph, and they were butting heads about this part in the red circle here, which basically looked at the investment flows in the blue bars, and then the investment needs up to 2030 in the gray bars. And this was controversial because what it shows ultimately is, first of all, that we need far more investment in climate action than we're currently seeing. A minimum 2 times more for developed countries, but for developing countries at least 4 times more, and potentially a lot more than that, up to 8 times more. But I think why this this graph was a bit controversial, quite controversial, is that what it shows essentially is that for developing countries, so for the poorer nations of the world, the lowest range of the estimate bar is the same level pretty much as the highest range of the estimated investment needs for developed countries. So while everywhere needs more investment in climate action, developing countries are going to need a lot more. And the US was getting anxious. The US government was getting anxious about this because it was an uncomfortable message that essentially the other countries are going to need a lot more investment. And part of why it's uncomfortable is because of the way that global wealth is currently distributed. So this is from Credit Suisse, the bank, and they do an estimate every year of the distribution of global wealth. And you can see that still around 2/3 of global wealth is located in North America and Europe. And so, you know, there's the famous adage from Willie Sutton, the bank robber, when he got caught, and they said, why do you rob banks? And he was alleged to have said, well, that's where the money is. And so if we're trying to think about the challenge of climate change and the need to move investments around, and it isn't necessarily all public investment, to be very clear, a lot of this wealth is in private hands. But if we're talking about where should we be allocating investment, the greatest needs are in developing countries, and yet the majority of wealth is still in richer countries, North America, Europe, increasingly China. But China's a very interesting case because it's you know, it's in aggregate, it's very rich, but on a per capita basis, it's still not particularly wealthy. So I think that sort of sets up a lot of the context. But in terms of, you know, why governments and rich country governments in particular should be providing climate finance, there's really 7 reasons that I've identified, at least. The first is the moral obligation. This comes from the sense that the richer countries have caused the most emissions cumulatively, and they, as we saw on the previous slide, they have the most wealth, and yet the poorest countries are going to be hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change, and they have the least resources able to address it. So on a sort of basic morality, climate justice approach, the idea is that that those who've caused the problem should be paying to clean it up, and that those that have done the least to cause it are the most deserving of support. It's also a bit of a legal requirement. So under the UN Convention on Climate Change that was created in 1992, and that the US is a party to, and then also under the Paris Agreement in 2015, it includes obligations on developed countries to provide climate finance to developing countries. The third reason is that climate finance can be thought of as an extension of domestic action, that every country ideally should be doing as much as it possibly can to reduce its emissions and to prepare for the impacts of climate change or to adapt. But that for various reasons, whether it's political or technological constraints or financial constraints, some countries might not be able to do as much domestically. And the US certainly faces a lot of political constraints on doing more on climate change domestically. And so there is an argument to be made that if for whatever reason, if you can't do as much at home, then if you provide support abroad to help other countries to do more, that can be a way of continuing to act even if you're deadlocked domestically. And it also addresses this question that comes up a lot of, well, why should we act if other countries aren't doing enough? And so providing investment and support to other countries to help them do more can be very useful. There's also an important means of diplomatic influence, that it bolsters the credibility of countries that contribute funding. It shows that they're keeping their word, that they're honoring the moral obligation and legal requirements that they've signed up to. But also, if you're funding other countries, they appreciate that generally, and so that's important. Fifth, it's good development practice. The more we understand about climate change, the more we see how it affects pretty much everything. But particularly in developing countries, it's important to think about how, if you're doing a project that may not on the surface appear related to climate change, so say you're building a school or you're constructing a highway, you might not immediately think, well, that's a climate project. It's certainly not like building a solar farm or a wind farm. But the impacts of climate change are almost certainly going to have an impact on that project, whether it's flooding over the road or the school needing advanced heating and cooling systems because of extreme weather. So on one level, you need to be thinking about, so what are the climate impacts that this project's going to face, and thinking early on about how do you change your development investment to make sure that it's resilient to those impacts. But also it's about thinking about, is there a way we can make this lower carbon? Is it up front? If we put solar panels on the school, for example, or we build it to be passively heated and cooled, so you don't need as much energy use, that's a great way of reducing emissions right from the get-go. And it's better to do that early than to have to come back in 5, 10, 15 years time and spend more money to change the project originally. So even if it's not climate change on its face, it's important to be thinking about climate change and to be potentially investing a little bit more up front, but that has cost savings down the line. And then the last two, it's a potential way to boost green jobs and exports, helping countries to transition to low carbon technologies, transition to renewable energy, for example. The US has a really strong reputation in science and innovation, and US products are exported all over the world. The US has a lot of great scientists that are doing research on advanced renewable energies and other clean technologies. And so if you're providing funding to help other countries to transition towards clean energy, you're actually building up potential export markets and potential sources of jobs. And finally, it's a way of enhancing security. The Pentagon and a lot of militaries around the world have talked about how climate change is one of the greatest threats that they see on the horizon, and that they see it as a threat multiplier, which essentially means that it's going to make existing problems worse. It's going to exacerbate existing security threats. So investing in climate action early, and particularly in adaptation, can help address some of those problems before they become things that are going to need more military interventions. So that was sort of a run through of why climate finance in general is important. This is a very complicated graphic. I don't expect anyone to understand it. I still don't perfectly understand it. But essentially this shows a snapshot, and not even the total. It's several years old, so it's already out of date, of the landscape of different climate finance institutions out there. And it's focused mostly on public financial institutions that work on climate change. And the key point is that there's an awful lot. It's very messy, it's very complicated, a lot of different institutions overlapping, trying to do different things, sometimes working together very well, sometimes not. In the red circle here is the Green Climate Fund. So essentially what I want to show with this graphic is just that the GCF is situated within a much bigger landscape. But I'm going to explain why, at least in my opinion, I think it's one of the most important institutions out there for climate finance. So why is that? The three big areas. First of all, it's ambitious. The GCF has a mandate to focus on transformational change. It's not about taking it does finance projects, but the idea is not to be doing just a project by project incremental work. The idea is to be thinking about what are the kind of ideas, interventions that we can fund in developing countries that can really help transform their systems, help them to adapt and to reduce emissions most effectively. And how can we use the public funding GCF has really catalytically to help shift their entire system and financial approach. Secondly, it's the largest climate-focused multilateral fund out there. And third, it works with governments, private sector and civil society. It's very open in terms of how it engages with different parts of society. Secondly, it's internationalist. It has a mandate from the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and then also from the Paris Agreement, to be the key fund to implement the Paris Agreement. And so that's really critical. It has essentially the international community's blessing and endorsement and guidance on to do its work. And it also has a board. It's governed by a board that contains equal numbers of developed and developing countries. So it sort of really reflects very effectively the sort of will of the international community. And then third, it's inclusive. A lot of developing countries are particularly worried about adaptation because they're already seeing the impacts of climate change right now. And so one of the challenges we see in climate finance is around 3/4 of funding is going towards emissions reductions to mitigation. And there's not enough funding. There's not enough funding in general, but there's certainly not enough funding for adaptation. And the Green Climate Fund has written into its founding documents the idea that it will have a 50-50 split between funding it allocates to mitigation and funding it allocates to adaptation. So for developing countries, that's very important to them. They see that as really important to being an inclusive fund that deals with all the climate needs that are out there. Furthermore, half of that adaptation funding, so essentially 25% of overall funding, is earmarked for the least developed countries, the small island developing states, and the African countries. And these three groups are the most vulnerable on most metrics to the impacts of climate change. So they're saying, you know, we want to make sure that these countries that traditionally often get left out get a big share of the pie. Finally, it allows developing countries to directly access funding. A lot of other climate funds, you have to go through an international intermediary like the World Bank or the UN Development Programme, and they can be very good, and a lot of countries choose to work through them. But there are countries that like to be able to access the funding directly, and so if a developing country institution passes the vetting processes the GCF has, it can get funding approved directly. And that's actually a really important way of helping build up domestic institutions and capacity. And essentially, it's kind of the old adage of teach someone, give someone a fish and they eat for a day, teach them to fish and they eat for a lifetime. If you can teach countries and help them build up domestic institutions and empower those institutions rather than being reliant on international intermediaries, it can often have really lasting results beyond just the project financing. It can help get them working and thinking in ways that means they can be a lot more self-sufficient, that they can attract investment themselves. So I think that's really important and transformational. And then related to that, it just works for a huge number of delivery partners, including NGOs, aid agencies, government ministries, and the private sector. So the Green Climate Fund board, I mentioned, is equal numbers of developed and developing countries. It has 24 board members. The US has a seat on that board, and their headquarters are in Songdo in South Korea. And it's one of the first agencies, really major agencies, that was located in Asia. This is a photo I took of the Secretariat Tower. It's the one in the middle with the weird triangles cut out of it. The fund has received $20 billion in pledges to date, and it's had 2 pledging rounds. The first one was in 2014. That was known as the Initial Resource Mobilization, or IRM. And then in 2019, governments again came together to make further pledges. The US didn't make a pledge in 2019. The Trump administration sat that one out. But the US in 2014 did make, at the time, the highest pledge of $3 billion. The second highest was Japan's, which was 1.5 billion. I've just realized this graph is not showing the decimal points, but if you imagine, it's rounding everything up. But anyway, so Japan made a pledge of 1.5 billion, the US made a pledge of 3 billion, The UK was 1.2 billion. But then in the second round, Japan and the UK actually overtook the US because they came back and pledged again, and that meant that the US fell from being the first highest contributor or the first highest pledger to being the third highest. But in terms of what they've actually been able to deliver, the US has only delivered 1 billion of the 3 billion that it pledged in 2014. So it's actually the sixth highest in terms of actual contributions, behind Sweden. The fund has approved projects totaling $10 billion now, and it's in the last few years, it's really ramped up its rate of approvals. And so of the 20 billion it has pledged, it's approved 10 billion of it, but it actually only has $12 billion in funding that's been paid in. So it's almost maxed out. It's going at a very quick rate in terms of when it gets the cash in from the countries that have made pledges, when they make their contributions, and most countries deliver their contributions over several years. It's almost as soon as it's getting the money in the door, it's approving it for projects. It's taking a little bit longer to disperse that money. So only $2.3 billion has been dispersed. But again, that's starting to grow quite quickly. And we're hoping to see that disbursement rate improve in the coming years. The fund has approved 192 projects in 128 countries, and you can see all the countries here. It's pretty much covered most of the developing world. There's still a few countries that haven't had a project yet, but they're getting there in terms of coverage. And in terms of what areas where this funding is going, the GCF has 8 result areas, 4 for adaptation and 4 for mitigation. And so you can see them along the bottom. The adaptation results areas are health, food and water security, livelihoods of people and communities, ecosystem and ecosystem services, infrastructure and the built environment. And they've been relatively balanced in how they've allocated funding across those areas. For mitigation, so for emissions reduction, they have energy generation and access, transport, buildings, cities, industries and appliances, and forest and land use. And the majority is going to energy, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because that's where the big chunk of the climate challenge is located. But it would be good, obviously, to see a lot more in transport, which is falling relatively short. And then this graphic kind of pulls everything that I've said so far together. So you can see so far the fund has received $12 billion in pledges. It's approved $10 billion of that. 6.5 billion is for public sector projects that are focused on working with governments. 3.4 billion of private sector projects. And then you see the different regions. So Africa has received the most, followed by Asia Pacific region, and then Latin America and Caribbean and Eastern European, the last. And then the vulnerable countries, so the least developed countries, the small island developing states and African states, have received the slight majority of funding. And then you see these are the 8 results areas moving further to the right. And then finally, 6 billion in absolute terms, but actually 3.2 billion in grant equivalent terms. And then adaptation has received about 3.03 billion in grant equivalent terms. So they are balanced in grant terms, has gone to mitigation and then adaptation. And then you see what the expected results are. So 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions reduced or avoided. And then 611 million people are benefiting from the adaptation projects. And this is all from the GCF's annual results report. I mentioned earlier that the GCF works through a wide range of partners to deliver the funding. There are 112 accredited entities. Of that, the majority are direct access, so they're based in developing countries. That includes NGOs, local banks, government agencies, and others. And then 41 international access, so that's a lot of aid agencies, international financial institutions, and some international banks as well. To get accredited to the fund, it's quite a rigorous process, and it takes a few years. But essentially what they're doing there is they're checking that you have the right financial policies, fiduciary safeguards, anti-money laundering practices, that essentially checking that you have the ability to program large amounts of money. And then also they have to pass requirements for environmental and social safeguards, including having strong gender policies. And that's essentially ensuring that the entities are equipped to manage projects and make sure that they're not harming local communities, and they have the right mechanisms in there to hear from potentially affected communities. The fund is pretty cost effective. This is a study that was commissioned, and it looks at the administrative expenses, or the operating expenses, as a share of the total investments approved. And it shows that not only is the fund doing well compared to other other public financial institutions, but it's actually doing well compared to private sector institutions. So you can see there the GCF is about 1% of their budget is going to operating expenses, compared to 4.6% of investments of Calvert Impact Capital. So pretty effective and efficient as far as financial institutions go. And then the other thing that I think that makes the fund pretty strong, and this is learning a lot of lessons from a history of development and climate financing that hasn't always been particularly positive. A history where there have been cases of corruption, there have been cases of communities being affected by projects and being displaced. The GCF created 3 independent units. They report directly to the board. The Secretariat does not control them, which again is best practice for financial institutions. And these 3 units are the Independent Evaluation Unit that evaluates GCF activities and does very, very helpful reports. I use them all the time. They're actually very helpful in making the case for why the GCF is good, but also how it can improve. That looks at the GCF's effectiveness and efficiency. The Independent Integrity Unit investigates allegations of fraud, corruption, misconduct, and other prohibited practices. So again, best practice with financial institutions is to have an independent unit. So if anyone does think anything could be amiss, they can go there and make a report in confidence, and this independent unit will investigate it. And then finally, the Independent Redress Mechanism that provides recourse to people who are affected or who may be affected by GCF projects and programs. So if there's a community in a developing country where a GCF project has been approved, they can raise concerns directly with this unit, and this unit will go off and investigate it and provide recommendations to the board if there needs to be changes made to the projects and the approaches. So again, I think these are really important because ideally we all want development and climate finance to be doing good in the world, but we do know that there are instances where things are challenging, and so having these 3 independent units is really important so that you can catch problems early and take action to rectify it. So the US history with the GCF, the US has had a seat on the board since the beginning of the fund. The fund was created in 2010 and it started approving projects in 2015. And the US has played a really key role in shaping the fund. It's actually been a champion of civil society consultation and information disclosure. And I think that's one thing they deserve a lot of credit for. Even during the Trump administration, US board members were pushing for strong standards on this. And the reason they were doing this was not because the President Trump thought it was important, but because Congress actually, over 25 years ago, passed a law. It's actually named after Nancy Pelosi because she spearheaded it, called the Pelosi Amendment. And that was based on a number of instances where projects at the World Bank and other international institutions were going ahead without properly talking to the communities that they were supposed to benefit. And so the Pelosi Amendment required the US to make sure that any international institution that it engaged with was properly consulting with with civil society and the local communities where the institution was providing funding. And that has meant that, you know, in all the international institutions the US engages in, the US representatives have been really strong at pushing the fund, the GCF and other funds, to make sure that they consult with civil society, they disclose information ahead of time. And that's been really welcome. What's not been as great is that Congress has never actually appropriated any money for the GCF. In the annual appropriations bills that they passed, they've never given a proper allocation to the Green Climate Fund. Despite this, in 2016 and 2017, the Obama administration was able to use funding from a flexible account called the Economic Support Fund to provide $1 billion to the GCF. And I'm very pleased that he did that. But it was controversial because it meant that, you know, that funding couldn't be used for other development activities. I think it was still the right thing to do, but it wasn't ideal. And, you know, ideally, we would like to see Congress appropriate money. In the last few years, the Biden administration has been pushing Congress to actually approve an allocation for the GCF. So in fiscal year 2022, so last year, the administration requested $1.25 billion for the Green Climate Fund. So that's the light green portion of the bar in this chart. The House actually bumped that up to 1.6 billion, and the Senate reduced it slightly to 1.45 billion. And so by the end of last year, if you'd asked me, I'd have said, things are good, things are looking good that the GCF can finally get a congressional appropriation. But in the final negotiations, there were a number of Republican members, particularly, that strongly opposed the GCF. I don't think the reasons for them opposing it were particularly good, but they opposed it nonetheless. And that meant that in the final agreement in the enacted budget that was passed in March this year, no money was allocated for the GCF once again. So it was a repeat of history, essentially. But this year, the administration, you know, is not giving up. They've put in a request for $1.6 billion for the Green Climate Fund. So we are working hard and working with a lot of the faith community and with other non-governmental organizations, including other development and climate groups, to try and make the case for why it's important to be funding the Green Climate Fund with at least $1.6 billion. And I say at least because obviously there's the $2 billion that the administration pledged and still hasn't delivered. Even if they can get 1.6, they'll still have 400 million left of that 2 billion to fulfill. But actually, in the 2019 replenishment, the US sat that out, but other countries came forward and doubled their pledges. So the US is still trying to catch up and deliver on an 8-year-old pledge. Meanwhile, other countries have come forward again and doubled. And the US is, as I said earlier, slipping behind in the rankings in terms of contributions. At WRI, we put together this fair share calculator a few years ago to inform the 2019 replenishment. And the way this worked was we looked at a country's gross national income, at their greenhouse gas emissions, at their population. And my colleagues developed a formula to calculate, so what's the fair share that countries should be providing? And essentially, the bare minimum, the benchmark we set for countries was that they should double their previous contribution. But that some countries that didn't do a particularly ambitious contribution the first time round should more than double if they weren't doing the fair share the first time. And so the US, we found, should be doing at least $8 billion to the 2019 replenishment. We didn't expect them to because we knew the Trump administration was not a fan of the Green Climate Fund. But nonetheless, that was what, you know, on a relatively empirical, objective analysis of the data, that was what we felt was the fair share of the US. So when it comes to the next replenishment, ideally the US should be not only have cleared that 3 billion that they originally promised, but actually make a new pledge, ideally at the level of 8 billion. And again, it's not 8 billion a year, it will be delivered over several years. And Democrats in Congress, some Democrats have been strongly pushing the idea that the US should be delivering $4 billion a year. So that has been good to see. But again, there's a lot of disagreement. It is pretty split along partisan lines, which is a problem. And I think there is a need for more outreach and more work. And again, I think bringing in as wide array of voices that support GCF funding is really important to make the case to members of Congress for why this should be a priority and why they should get behind it. So I'll end there, but I'm very happy to take questions. Sorry, I realized I ended my screen sharing too soon, but I had my email address there and Twitter handle. I can put that in the chat as well.
Thank you so much, Joe. I was fascinated. Many questions came to mind. And I'm gonna sort of kick it off with one or two, and then look to the chat. And since we're an intimate group, I encourage people, rather than put a question in the chat, raise your electronic hand using the reactions button. I will just say, you can tell all your friends, apparently there's some sort of Zoom technical difficulty that at least some people are experiencing. I've been in the background managing, trying to help resolve that for others. So we will circulate the recording. Please assure your friends who you know care about this issue that we will do so. Sometimes Zoom does not cooperate. So I guess my first question for you is, I found one of your earlier slides very fascinating. I mean, it felt like, you laid out sort of why providing climate finance in some ways was a great use or a great mechanism for projecting soft power by the US. And I'm wondering if that line of argument actually has any traction with the detractors of the Green Climate Fund. And, in your experience, what does get the isolationists in Congress to give a second look or even a third look to this program? Because, as you presented this evening, it looks like a fairly solid program. It plays a key role in the financing landscape. So first, what does work with the isolationists and the detractors? Second, can you give us some insight into at least the public line on why some Republicans were against the 2022 enactment? What were the principal reasons that they were offering as their explanation?
Sure, yeah. So I think the arguments that are pretty pertinent and that speak to some of the sort of concerns that some members of Congress have about the GCF are indeed about, soft power influence. And to answer your second part of your question first, actually, the big argument against the GCF has been that it's a UN slush fund, that there's no accountability, which is not true. As I showed, there's all these independent units. There's a board that the US has a seat on, and many other developed countries. And indeed, those other developed countries are often quite aligned with the US in a lot of the areas. So it's not like they're willing to let things slide and not be accountable. But there's also one of the issues that has been raised is that the GCF is giving funding to countries that the US government does not like, or at least parts of the US government do not like. So it's true that the GCF has approved projects in Cuba, in Sudan, and they approved one project in China. I don't think that China is actually looking to the GCF for funding in general. The project that the GCF did approve there was a loan, so it will be paid back. And it was I think what's much more likely in the future is to see that China will actually maybe make a contribution to the GCF itself. One of the remarkable things about this fund is that a lot of developing countries have started to make contributions to it as well, at relatively small levels. But as a symbolic gesture, I think it's important because they've said we're not looking to just be taking from this fund, we're looking to be contributing to it as well, because we recognize how important it is as an endeavor of the global community. So I think that but it has still, nonetheless, those projects have been used by the detractors to say this is a fund that is not supporting US foreign policy. I think actually, the more that the US pulls back from this fund, the more they're actually ceding influence to other countries, including countries that they might be rivals with. So I think it's actually, I flip the argument on its head and say, you're saying that you don't want to support this fund because you don't think it's supporting US interests. I think actually it has supported a lot of US interests so far, but there is a big risk that if the US does just pull back completely, if it's just sitting on the board but it's not a contributor, that it won't have any sway over other countries when they're deciding on policies and projects to fund. And so I think that it's in America's interest to, just as it's in America's interest to engage in other international institutions, to actually to keep a seat at the table rather than to pull back, because the pulling out is the guaranteed way to make sure that these institutions don't reflect US priorities and interests. So I think that's one. I think the other two arguments that do, the national security argument, I think does have some sway. So that's the second one that I would use. And then the economic argument, if you can show how it will benefit jobs, particularly in congressional districts, that's important. And there are a number of US entities that have been accredited that are engaged in delivering GCF projects. And so not only are they directly channeling GCF money, but it's also, creating jobs for these institutions. And it includes some big private sector investors based in the US who can see the value of the fund, who want to engage with it. But they, so I think that they are starting to engage on the Hill. They're going and meeting different members of Congress and sort of saying, look, we're invested in this fund. We're receiving money from it, but we're also putting in our own capital into these projects that the GCF is supporting, and I think that helps to be able to say that. But I think the more data that we have, and the Treasury Department actually used to have some really good data about congressional districts and which congressional districts actually are benefiting from international funding. And engaging with these international funds. They haven't published that recently, but I think anything like that, it's a good reminder to me actually that I need to reach out to them and see if they are still tracking those kind of data points, because I think they're very useful.
Thank you, Joe. So next in the stack is Doris and then David. And then I think I'll try to summarize one or two in the chat.
Thank you so much, Joe. So good to hear your presentation and get some history and a broader understanding of the Green Climate Fund. I have been trying, not as hard as I could, to figure out just how much the US did put into the Green Climate Fund out of 2021, what was in the 2022 budget, for example, maybe zero, okay, and what is sitting in Build Back Better. So in 2021 and 2022, we have given nothing. Is that what you're saying? Oh my gosh, that is so embarrassing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I agree. It is embarrassing and unfortunate. The administration did push for it. It was really unfortunate. I think both the administration and Congress could have done more to fight for it. The champions, at least, of the GCF in Congress. But there is a very strong and vocal opposition to the fund. And I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that this is a fund that provides money to developing countries and it works on climate change. So there's going to be a constituency in Congress that no matter what argument we make for it, for those two reasons alone, they will not like it. But you know, strangely, they are actually funding other climate funds. They did approve funding for other ones. So it's kind of weird because, you know, if that principle is true, if it's just about climate, then you should also not be supporting those. But they have supported some other funds, just not the most, arguably the most important, the most symbolic. And
I think when Nancy Pelosi was at COP26, she even said, "We're supporting this."
Yes, yeah.
And
yeah, so it is disappointing. Now, I would say there's a big caveat, which is that the route that the Obama administration went, which is to take money from the Economic Support Fund, they wouldn't be able to take a huge amount, but they could potentially take, you know, 500 million. I say not a huge amount, obviously for all of us, it's a huge amount. But in terms of international funding flows, it's a relatively small amount. There is a potential that they could do that again, and they are exploring that. So I've not given up hope that they could, for fiscal year 22, still make a contribution. It wouldn't be a congressionally appropriated one. But essentially the last time the US made any actual payment into the Green Climate Fund was in 2017. It was the last week of Obama's term in office, and he signed it over as one of the last things he did as president. He'd already done 500 million the year before, and he did another 500 million. So I think there's already precedent that could happen, and they are looking at if the funding is there in that account to be able to make that kind of contribution. So we are pushing very hard that they should find as much as they can. It's kind of the diplomatic equivalent of searching under the couches for spare change and trying to pull it all together. But because there's also a lot of other things that account is supposed to be funding, so they're trying to work out what other things are obligated and what at the end of the day will be left over for the GCF. But yeah, it's not the end, and again they're trying hard in FY22, and I hope that they are gonna prioritize it more in the negotiations, because ultimately I think the reason that it dropped out after what looked like pretty good Senate and House bills, and so when Pelosi went to COP, she was saying, and I don't think she didn't believe it. She was saying things are looking good. We stand behind it. We will be able to provide money for it. But the negotiations, in the last final moments of any kind of negotiation, things can fall apart, and it really requires all the champions of the Green Climate Fund, the people who are in the room at the very end, to stand firm on that and to make it a real priority. And it frankly just wasn't. Your question about Build Back Better doesn't have any international funding components in it, so it's not on the table there. And obviously Build Back Better has run into trouble itself, but it's not on the table there. If it's going to come, it's likely going to come in a regular annual appropriation bill.
Thank you so much for that answer, Joe. David, jump right in.
Yeah, Joe, if Congress does not appropriate money, and if money has to be shifted from other funds, who is hurt by that? Who loses?
It's a great question. Ideally, no one. And I say that because between fiscal year 2021 and fiscal year 2022, the Economic Support Fund account was increased by $1 billion. So the hope is that within that $1 billion increase, there were a lot of promises made in the bill of, fund this and that. But what the administration is doing now is they're looking at what are the things that we've made commitments to, or at least promises for that Economic Support Fund increase. And then at the end of the day, after you add in all of that, how much is left for the Green Climate Fund? So ideally, it's not going to hurt any other priority, because ideally it can come out of that $1 billion increase and that it's not going to take money from other priorities. The thing that caused trouble in 2016 and 2017 is that there were other programs that were expecting funding from the Economic Support Fund, and the Obama administration had to make a really tough call and say, we're actually going to put the money to the GCF instead. I don't know exactly what programs they were, but it was other development assistance. But hopefully, if they if they are able to do it in fiscal year 22, it won't be like that because they did grow the budget for the Economic Support Fund, and there was an understanding that part of growing that budget was to provide some flexibility if you needed to do. This is essentially Plan B. Plan A is to get a direct appropriation for the GCF. Plan B is to take it out of the Economic Support Fund. And I think there was in those negotiations for fiscal year 22, there was when it was realized that they wouldn't be able to appropriate money directly for the GCF, it was, I think, part of why they increased the ESF that much was to provide some space for the GCF. But again, yeah, hopefully not, but it's certainly a plan B. It's not the ideal.
Thanks again, Joe, I really want to honor your time. So the very last question, I'm going to try and summarize one that came my way. So first off, could you expand a little bit on how the GCF gender policy work, gets applied in practice? Please address any challenges, and also, do you feel like there's enough technical assistance to under-resourced potential applicants? And I just want to, I guess, as a third question to pepper you with at the end, I hear you saying our best role is to try and engage the Republicans, the offices that were reticent to make the direct appropriation. But is there anything that you think we as a faith-based organization have a special role in doing? Are there any offices that you know of who you feel like, yeah, they're at the tipping point and they could hear from somebody like USJ and it might make the difference?
Yeah, I think definitely I'll take them in reverse order. But I think the Republicans, it's really important to reach out to Republican offices, and in the committee it only needs one vote to get through, but in the whole on the floor of the Senate is going to need 60. So sorry, not one vote. In the committee, you only need one Republican to cross the aisle to get stuff passed. But in the floor of the Senate, that vote is going to need 60. So so that's a challenge. I would say it's also important to shore up Democrats, including the champions, to show that you're behind it, and also to ask with them, because they know much better than me the congressional politics of this and the math and how that breaks out. But I think that in terms of Republicans to reach out to, Susan Collins obviously is the always the swing vote, but also Lisa Murkowski. She is Senator for Alaska and is very concerned about climate change. When people have talked to her about the Green Climate Fund before, she's actually said, well, can I get funding for Alaska for this? And obviously that's not really the way it works. But she has shown an interest in how we finance climate change and how we act on it. So I'd say those two are particularly important. But I think, Marco Rubio, in theory, is from a very climate vulnerable state, ought to appreciate this. Also, I think understands the migration elements and the fact that that climate change is driving increased migration. And so I think, maybe, some of those arguments as it relates to security, as it relates to sort of helping, most migrants that are displaced by climate change do not want to leave their country. I mean, most migrants in general, most refugees, sorry, in general, are not, don't want to leave their country, but they're forced to. And so how can investments through things like the Green Climate Fund help address that early on? In terms of technical assistance to potential applicants, yeah, one of the big challenges for developing countries is accessing the funding, and particularly for the smaller countries and poorer countries, they have very stretched, very small ministries that are very understaffed. And so to put together the project proposal can be really difficult. Whereas if you're a bigger country, if you're working with an international intermediary, they have a lot of experts that can do it all for them. And so I think that, yeah, there is a need for more resources. The GCF has actually been very good at providing funding. They call it readiness funding, which is what it says on the tin, helping countries to get ready to put together the applications to get GCF funding. So readiness funding, I think, is very important. The GCF carves out a bunch of money for that. I think every country can access, I think it's $1 million per year to help just in terms of putting projects together. But there is a need for them to be more flexible in that, because often it can't be used to pay the cost of a full-time staff member. You can only use it to hire a consultant short term, which is not ideal, because consultants end up being often international. They often require a higher salary, whereas actually paying for a local staff member full-time who's going to be there for several years, who's not going to sort of come in for a few weeks and then dash out, can be much more beneficial to preparing a project, because it does take years to do that. And then on the gender policy, yes, so the GCF gender policy is one of the more advanced ones of multilateral funds. I'm not an expert on it. There's a colleague that I work quite a lot with at Heinrich Boll Foundation in Washington, DC, called Liana Shalatek, and she is an absolute guru on this, and she's brilliant. I thoroughly recommend reading some of the stuff she's worked on, but I can give you a sort of a high level overview, which is that every project, every entity that wants to get accredited to work with the GCF needs to show that it has a gender policy on its books and it has certain requirements there. But then every single project has to have a gender policy and a gender component there. And so, they have to outline how the project will affect women, and how they're going to address any potential negative impacts. And so as part of the documentation that you have to submit to the board in order to get a project passed, one of the things is to outline in quite a lot of detail how they're going to do that. Some projects are not great on that, others are brilliant. And so there's a lot of work that Liana has led in particular to try and get that, try and get the gender action plans that are part of these projects to be as good as they can be. But in terms of like the requirements on the books, they're really good. It's just about getting the actual implementers to deliver on those. Sorry, I went on a bit long, but
that's all right.
I mean, for a few minutes if there are more questions. But.
No, that's a very realistic answer, and gee whiz, it feels like it describes most of life and so many of our social justice issues and challenges. Good parameters on the books, but delivering in practice is what needs to happen, and that, I mean, that that sums up our climate crisis, I think, rather succinctly. So I want to thank you, Joe. We deeply appreciate your expertise and the time you spent with us. We're running long, so I just want to let you go. And thank you, everybody. Let's just take a moment to say thank you to Joe. I'll just remind everybody else on the call that we are trying to go out on this topic. I'll be candid with this group. These offices are not granting meetings on this topic. Anna and I are doing our best, But we're going to probably have to stretch it out. Just pursue these offices until they grant the meetings, and then rotate and pivot into engagement. But we do have a meeting with Senator Durbin, and we do have a meeting with Rubio, and there's a few others that might drop. But it'll probably be a relatively small outing next week and or the week after. But this is really important work, as you heard Joe explain. So thank you so much, Joe. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, and please do keep in touch. As you know, I'm really appreciative of all the work you do. I think it's really important to have a lot of different messengers, you know, business voices, national security voices, faith voices. You know, frankly, like, they see environmentalists coming and they're like, oh yeah, we know what you're going to say. And so I think it's really helpful to have other groups engaged. And I, you know, love to stay in touch and support your work. But thank you again for inviting me.
Well, we pledge to be brave in our advocacy and